Have you ever wondered what lurks in the shadows of a dark forest at night? What if you found yourself lost, with no way out, and stumbled upon something beyond your wildest nightmares? Alice and James, a couple eager for adventure, are about to face this terrifying reality. Their journey into the heart of the Australian wilderness turns into a gripping encounter with the supernatural. As night falls, the line between the real and the unreal blurs, leading them into a spine-chilling ordeal. Can they survive the horrors that await them? It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend away from the hustle and bustle of Sydney. Alice and James, a couple in their early 30s, had planned a getaway to the tranquil expanse of the Australian outback. James, with his rugged love for the outdoors, had meticulously prepared for this trip. He had pored over maps, plotted trails, and packed supplies, ready to escape into nature. "Are you sure we're ready for this?" Alice asked, her voice tinged with both excitement and apprehension as she secured her backpack. "Absolutely," James replied with a confident smile. "We've got everything we need: a detailed map, a compass, plenty of food and water, and our sense of adventure." The early morning sky was a brilliant blue as they left the city behind, the sun rising over the horizon. They drove through winding country roads, the landscape gradually changing from bustling suburbia to the serene beauty of the Australian wilderness. Tall eucalyptus trees lined the roads, their leaves shimmering in the sunlight. By midday, they arrived at the edge of the forest. It was vast and untouched, stretching out as far as the eye could see. The air was crisp and filled with the earthy scent of pine and eucalyptus. They parked their car, strapped on their backpacks, and set off down a well-marked trail, eager to explore. The initial part of their hike was idyllic. Birds chirped merrily from the treetops, and the underbrush rustled with the movements of unseen creatures. Alice and James walked hand in hand, marveling at the natural beauty around them. The forest was alive with the vibrant colors of wildflowers, and the sun filtered through the canopy, casting playful shadows on the ground. "This is perfect," Alice sighed, her worries melting away as they ventured deeper into the forest. James nodded, his eyes scanning the trail ahead. "I knew you'd love it. Let's see how far we can go before setting up camp." They followed the trail as it wound through the trees, occasionally stopping to take in the stunning views. Time seemed to slip away as they lost themselves in the tranquility of their surroundings. They paused for lunch by a bubbling stream, savoring the peacefulness of the moment. As the afternoon wore on, they resumed their hike, the path becoming less distinct. The trees grew closer together, their branches intertwining to form a dense canopy overhead. The underbrush thickened, and the trail markers became harder to spot. "Do you think we're still on the right path?" Alice asked, a hint of concern creeping into her voice. James glanced at the map, frowning slightly. "We're still heading in the right direction. According to this, there's a clearing up ahead where we can camp for the night." Alice nodded, trusting James's navigation skills. They pressed on, but the forest grew darker and more foreboding. The sun was sinking lower in the sky, casting long shadows that danced eerily among the trees. A thick mist began to weave through the forest, curling around their legs like ghostly fingers. "I don't like this," Alice whispered, her unease growing with every step. "We'll be fine," James reassured her, though his own confidence was waning. "Let's just find that clearing and set up camp." They continued walking, but the path became increasingly difficult to follow. The familiar sounds of the forest had faded, replaced by an eerie silence. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes. "Are you sure we're going the right way?" Alice asked, her voice trembling. James checked the map again, but it made no sense in the dim light. They had wandered far from their planned route, and the landscape was unrecognizable. He swallowed hard, trying to keep his composure. "I think we might be lost," he admitted, his voice barely audible. Alice's eyes widened in fear. "What do we do now?" "We'll find our way back," James said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Let's keep moving and see if we can find a landmark or a familiar trail." They walked in silence, their footsteps crunching on the forest floor. The light was fading quickly, and soon they were plunged into darkness. James pulled out his flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom. They were surrounded by the dense, impenetrable forest on all sides. "This doesn't feel right," Alice whispered. "Maybe we should go back." But the path behind them had vanished into the mist. They were trapped in the heart of the forest, with no clear way out. "We have no choice," James said finally. "We'll have to find another way." As they ventured deeper into the dark forest, the sense of unease grew stronger. The air was heavy and still, and an unsettling silence surrounded them. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig sent chills down their spines. "Do you feel like we're being watched?" Alice asked, her eyes darting around nervously. James nodded, his own nerves fraying. "Yeah, it's creepy. Let's keep moving." They walked in silence, each step echoing in the oppressive stillness. The light from James's flashlight cast long, eerie shadows that seemed to dance and flicker with a life of their own. The darkness pressed in around them, and the forest took on an otherworldly quality. "I think I see something up ahead," Alice said, her voice barely above a whisper. Through the mist, they saw a faint light flickering in the distance. As they approached, the outline of a cabin emerged from the shadows. It stood alone in the clearing, its windows dark and lifeless, the door slightly ajar. "Do you think it's safe?" Alice asked, her voice trembling. James hesitated before replying. "I don't know, but we need shelter for the night. We can check it out." They approached the cabin cautiously. The air around it was cold, and the silence was deafening. James pushed the door open, and it creaked on its hinges, revealing a dimly lit interior. The cabin was old and decrepit, its walls covered in cobwebs. The floor was littered with debris, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. Alice shivered as she stepped inside, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. "Let's just stay here for the night," James said, trying to sound reassuring. "We'll find our way out in the morning." They set up their sleeping bags in the corner of the cabin, trying to make themselves comfortable. The cold seeped through the walls, and the wind howled outside, rattling the windows. "Do you hear that?" Alice asked, her voice trembling. James listened intently. At first he heard nothing but the wind, but then, faintly, he heard it too. A soft, mournful wailing coming from somewhere outside the cabin. "What is that?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Alice shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't know. It sounds like someone crying." They huddled together, their hearts pounding. The wailing grew louder, more distinct. It was the sound of a woman in distress, her cries echoing through the night. "We should check it out," James said, though he didn't sound convinced. "No," Alice replied quickly. "It's too dangerous. We don't know what's out there." But the cries continued, growing more desperate. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, James grabbed his flashlight and headed for the door. "Stay here," he told Alice. "I'll be right back." Alice watched as he stepped outside, the darkness swallowing him up. She waited, her heart racing, the sound of the woman's cries filling her ears. Minutes passed, and there was no sign of James. "James!" she called out, her voice shaking. "Are you there?" There was no answer. The silence was oppressive, and the cold seemed to seep into her bones. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stay calm. Suddenly, the door creaked open, and James stumbled back inside. He was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "What happened?" Alice asked, rushing to his side. I saw her," he stammered. "There's a woman out there. A ghost. She's crying and she pointed to something in the woods. I think she wants us to follow her." Alice felt a chill run down her spine. "We can't," she said firmly. "It's too dangerous." But James shook his head. "We have to. She's trying to tell us something." Despite their fear, they knew they couldn't stay in the cabin forever. James took a deep breath and led the way outside, the flashlight trembling in his hand. The ghostly woman was still there, her figure faint and shimmering in the darkness. She stood at the edge of the clearing, her eyes filled with sorrow. As they approached, she began to move, gliding silently through the trees. They followed her, the light from the flashlight casting eerie shadows on the ground. The forest was even more menacing in the dark. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The woman led them deeper and deeper until they were far from the cabin. Finally, she stopped in a small clearing. The ground was covered in leaves, and the air was thick with the scent of earth and decay. She pointed to a spot on the ground, her eyes pleading. James knelt down and began to clear away the leaves. Beneath them, he found an old, rusted locket, half buried in the dirt. He picked it up, and the woman's figure flickered, her expression one of relief. "What is this?" Alice asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James examined the locket. It was tarnished and worn, but he could make out a faint engraving on the surface. A name, Eleanor. "I think it's hers," he said, looking up at the ghostly figure. The woman nodded, a faint smile appearing on her face. Then, as suddenly as she had appeared, she vanished, leaving them alone in the clearing. They stood in stunned silence, the locket clutched in James's hand. The forest around them was silent, the air heavy with an unspoken tension. "What do we do now?" Alice asked, her voice shaking. James looked around, trying to get his bearings. "We need to find out more about this place. Maybe there's something in the cabin that can help us." They made their way back to the cabin, the darkness pressing in around them. The ghostly encounter had left them both shaken, and they moved quickly, eager to be inside again. Once back in the cabin, they searched for clues. The place was filled with old, dusty furniture and forgotten relics. Alice found an old oil lamp and lit it, casting a warm, flickering glow over the room. "Look at this," she said, pulling out an old leather-bound journal from a drawer. The pages were yellowed with age, and the writing was faded but still legible. James took the journal and began to read. It was the diary of a woman named Eleanor, written decades ago. The entry spoke of a happy life in the cabin with her husband, but as he read further, the tone darkened. "She talks about strange happenings in the forest," James said, his voice filled with unease. "She writes about hearing voices and seeing figures in the trees. And then her husband disappeared." Alice felt a chill run down her spine. "Do you think it's the same woman, the one we saw?" James nodded slowly. "It must be. This locket must have belonged to her. Maybe she's been trying to find it all these years." They continued reading, piecing together Eleanor's tragic story. She had lived in the cabin with her husband Thomas during the early 1900s. They were happy and in love, but their peace was shattered by the arrival of something dark and malevolent in the forest. Eleanor wrote of strange noises at night, whispers that seemed to come from the trees, and a growing sense of dread. Thomas tried to reassure her, but he too began to feel the presence of something sinister. One night, Thomas went out into the forest and never returned. Eleanor searched for him for days, but he was nowhere to be found. Despairing and alone, she eventually succumbed to the same dark presence that had taken her husband. "She was buried in the forest," James said, his voice barely audible. She wrote about how she could feel the forest closing in around her, trapping her spirit here. Alice shivered. "Do you think that's what she wants? To be free?" James nodded. "I think so. We need to find her grave and lay her to rest." Determined to help Eleanor, they decided to stay in the cabin for the night and search for her grave in the morning. But as the night wore on, the atmosphere in the cabin grew increasingly oppressive. The wind outside howled like a banshee, and the temperature dropped sharply. The walls of the cabin creaked and groaned, and the shadows seemed to move of their own accord. Alice and James huddled together, trying to stay warm. They could hear faint whispers in the wind, eerie and indistinct, as if the forest itself was alive and watching them. "Do you think it's Eleanor?" Alice asked, her voice trembling. James shook his head. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it's not friendly." As the night dragged on, they struggled to stay awake, the oppressive cold and fear sapping their strength. Just when they thought they couldn't take any more, the door to the cabin slammed open, and a freezing gust of wind swept through the room. Standing in the doorway was Eleanor, her ghostly figure flickering in the lamplight. Her eyes were filled with sorrow, and she pointed once more to the locket in James's hand. "We need to find her grave," James said, his voice firm. "We need to lay her to rest." Alice nodded, though she was terrified. "But how? We don't even know where to start looking." James glanced at the journal, an idea forming in his mind. "Maybe there's a clue in here, something we missed." They scoured the pages, looking for any mention of a grave or a burial site. Finally, they found it, a passage that described a small clearing near the cabin, where Eleanor had often gone to gather her thoughts. "It's got to be there," James said, his voice filled with determination. "That's where we'll find her grave." As dawn approached, they prepared to venture back into the forest. The first light of morning was just beginning to break through the trees, casting long shadows over the ground. "We have to be careful," James said, his voice tense. "We don't know what else might be out there." They stepped outside, the air cold and crisp. The forest was eerily silent, the only sound their footsteps crunching on the frosty ground. They followed the directions from the journal, heading towards the clearing where Eleanor had spent so much time. The path was overgrown and difficult to navigate. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches forming a tangled web that blocked out the light. They pushed through the underbrush, their breaths coming in ragged gasps as they struggled to keep moving. Finally, they reached the clearing. It was a small, secluded spot, surrounded by tall, ancient trees. The ground was covered in a thick layer of leaves, and the air was filled with the scent of earth and decay. "This must be it," James said, his voice barely audible. "This is where she's buried." They began to search the clearing, looking for any sign of a grave. It was difficult work, and the cold made their fingers numb and clumsy. But after what felt like hours, they found it. A small, unmarked mound of earth, half hidden beneath the leaves. James knelt down and began to clear away the leaves and debris. Beneath them, he found a simple wooden cross, its surface worn and weathered by time. "This is it," he said, his voice filled with awe. "This is her grave." Alice stood beside him, her heart pounding. "What do we do now?" James took the locket and placed it gently on the cross. "We say a prayer. We ask her to rest in peace." They knelt together, their heads bowed, and began to pray. The wind picked up, swirling around them in a frenzy, and the air grew colder. But as they prayed, the oppressive feeling that had surrounded them began to lift. Eleanor's ghostly figure appeared once more, her expression one of gratitude. She reached out towards them, her fingers brushing the locket. Then, slowly, she began to fade, her form dissolving into the light. "She's gone," Alice whispered, tears streaming down her face. "She's finally at peace." James nodded, his own eyes filled with tears. "We did it. We helped her." With Eleanor's spirit at rest, the forest around them seemed to come alive. The oppressive darkness lifted and the air grew warmer. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the birds began to sing once more. "We should head back to the cabin and gather our things," James said, his voice filled with relief. "Then we can find our way out of here." They made their way back through the forest, the path now clear and easy to follow. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting a warm, golden glow over the ground. It felt as though the forest itself was welcoming them, guiding them home. Back at the cabin, they packed up their belongings, their spirits lifted by the knowledge that they had helped Eleanor find peace. They left the cabin behind, stepping out into the morning light with a renewed sense of hope. As they walked, they talked about their experience, reflecting on the events of the past night. They marveled at the strength and resilience of Eleanor, and the courage it had taken to face the darkness and find her way to the light. "We did something good," Alice said, her voice filled with pride. "We helped her find peace." James nodded, his heart swelling with emotion. "And we survived. We made it through." They followed the path out of the forest, their steps light and sure. The wilderness that had seemed so menacing the night before now felt like a place of wonder and beauty. They had faced their fears and emerged stronger for it. As they reached the edge of the forest, they looked back one last time. The trees stood tall and proud, their leaves rustling in the breeze. It was a place of mystery and magic, a place where the past and the present intertwined. "We'll never forget this," James said, his voice filled with awe. "This was a once-in-a-lifetime experience." Alice nodded, her eyes shining with gratitude. "We were meant to be here, to help Eleanor, to find each other." They turned and walked away, the forest behind them a memory they would carry with them forever. The sun was high in the sky, and the world was bright and full of promise. They had faced the darkness and found their way to the light, and in doing so, they had discovered a strength within themselves they never knew they had. As they drove away, they couldn't help but feel a sense of peace and fulfillment. They had been through a harrowing ordeal, but they had come out the other side stronger and more connected than ever. The haunting in the Australian wilderness had tested them in ways they could never have imagined, but it had also shown them the power of love, courage, and the human spirit. And as they drove back toward the safety and familiarity of their everyday lives, they knew they would never forget the lessons they had learned and the strength they had discovered within themselves.